Welcome to Benedictus Dominus. My name is Nolan Martin, and today I am presenting on the cleansing of the temple. Did Christ signify the destruction of the temple? Or is action of the cleansing of the temple a view of his messianic authority? The cleansing of the temple and the meaning has been explored by many scholars like E.P. Saunders, Craig Evans, and many other commentaries of the Bible. There's been many speculations that take into account the size of the temple, the core of the Gentiles, the money changers, the animals, and the political state of the Jews and the Romans. So, the cleansing of the temple for the Synoptic Gospels means that Christ is the Messiah who came to save all and makes a place of worship. However, the Gospel of John rather shows Christ as a sacrifice for all. There's your short answer. Let's get into the longer answer of it. Alright, some scholars like E.P. Saunders speculate that Christ signified the destruction of the temple. However, the scholars on the other side, like Craig Evans, who critique and refute E.P. Saunders because the evangelist would have signified this action or put emphasis on the sign of destruction of the physical temple. Additionally, Evans presents that if Jesus had truly meant to say the physical temple was to be destroyed, then he surely would have met capital punishment sooner, because rabbinic tradition warns capital punishment for threats against the temple. So what Craig Evans is saying, in gist, is that Christ would have died sooner if he had truly meant the physical destruction of the temple. Additionally, Craig Evans, in his critique and self-study, also writes about how he believes Jesus' actions was a display of how the temple was corrupt and was ridding the temple of the corruption. So, hypothetically, if Jesus did intend to destroy the temple, the act of the destruction does not rule out the act of the cleansing of the temple, according to Evans. He states in the Old Testament, when threats of destruction occur, they often accompany accusations of religious corruption and profanation of the temple. So, in order to support this claim, he references Hosea 6:6. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, and knowledge of God rather than burnt offering. So, Hosea here is rebuking the priests for not following the law, and he calls them robbers. Then, in Hosea 9:15, the prophet is going to drive them out of their house because of their wickedness. So Evans supported his claim by showing that in the Old Testament, Hosea is rebuking the actions of these people and calling them robbers, and then he is driving them out. That the prophet is going to drive them out of their house because of their wickedness. So calling the temple priests robbers and then driving them out because of their wickedness. Hopefully I clarified that idea. So yeah, the cleansing of the temple is pretty intense situation to try to analyze, and there's so much there. Many scholars, like I've mentioned, E.P. Saunders, Craig Evans, John Lambrecht, and John Ferguson. I mean, there's so many people who just have their say on this. The coffee is still really hot. Okay, so now to explore John Lambrecht, who's another scholar who writes on this area. So Lambrecht defends the position that Jesus was not going to destroy the temple, nor is attempting to destroy it. So there are two different events that of when the authorities question him after he returns to Jerusalem after the withered fig tree, and the destruction of the temple foretold in Mark 13:1-2. Lambrecht also writes that there's a Markan sandwich of verses 15 through 19 of the cleansing of the temple, thus showing that Christ is making a house of prayer and not a business for the robbers. So, what is going on there? Well, Lambrecht is arguing that, hey, these are two different days and two different events that are occurring. The withered fig tree and the destruction of the temple did not occur at the same time. So, thus, Jesus was not meaning to do physical destruction to the temple. And the significance of the cleansing of the temple, according to Lambrecht, is that Christ is making a house of prayer, and that it is not a business for robbers. So similarly to Lambrecht, we have the scholar / writer John Ferguson, who affirms that these actions were to create a house of prayer or restore the house of prayer. So Ferguson alludes to the cleansing taking place in the court of Gentiles. Now, in short, the court of Gentiles is like the outermost court. It is as farthest a Gentile can go into the temple. It is the biggest area in the temple, which I will get into further. So, Christ, according to Ferguson, is cleansing the court from the robbers to make a place for the Gentiles, because Jesus says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." So you have that idea on top of it, that Christ is creating a house of prayer. He is cleansing it from the robbers, but he's specifically now cleansing it for all people. He's cleansing it for all nations. He is making room because the Passover is near. So, supporting Ferguson, we have another scholar, P.M. Casey, who also writes about the court of Gentiles. So, to push the perspective of the cleansing, he iterates Isaiah 56:7 to show that Jesus knows that they are accepted and able to worship in the temple. All right, so Isaiah 56:7. "Them I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." So, even the Gentiles who keep the Sabbath will be given a house of prayer by God. So, however, because there is corruption in trade, there is no room for the Gentiles, so Christ is making room for them. So when Passover comes, they can pray. Additionally, how can one pray in such a busy area? Christ, according to Casey, was purifying the court for worship. So, there you have it. We have a lot of scholars saying, no, we do not like E.P. Saunders's point of view that Christ was actually trying to destroy the temple. We like this point of view where he's cleansing the temple, making room. There's more evidence for that, according to these scholars. So let's dive deeper into what is really happening here at the temple. So the corruption of the temple, such as the money changers, the Roman government, and the scribes, and more, made the temple unclean. If one was seen as unclean due to the purity laws, then they would not enter the temple, even if it was a court of the Gentiles. We know that purity was very important to worship at the temple, as seen as from the Oxford Biblical Source. Oxford Biblical Source is just a biblical study online that I found, and it stated that the temple courts were therefore inappropriate places for men who had just had an emission of semen, or for women who were menstruating. So these purity laws or regulations were in place in order to maintain the holiness of the temple and not to shame people. So there's laws in place that you could not enter the temple if you were seen as unclean. So there's a reason for Christ cleansing the temple. He is making the temple clean again. He is trying to rid money changers, the Roman government, and the scribes from the temple. Well, we can argue about the money changers another time and get more in deep to that, because some scholars do speculate that Christ wasn't exactly mad at the money changers for changing money itself. So if like some scholars speculate that Christ was intending to destroy the temple, how come he never referenced it in the cleansing? Yeah, how come Christ never referenced destroying the temple in the cleansing? Well, you'd be like, well, it was referenced in John's gospel. Well, John wrote that Christ was referring to his body in his gospel. So furthermore, why would Christians attend the temple if Christ intended to destroy it? We know from the early writer Eusebius that Christians worshipped in the temple, and he reinforced this by showing that James himself would go, the Apostle James himself would go to the temple and pray, and that he would go there so much and on his knees that his knees were like a camel's knees, like they were hardened. So there would have been an overwhelming amount of evidence to show that the apostles and disciples of Christ were mistaken into going to the temple to worship. So there had to be an overwhelming amount of evidence to go against that, because we have Eusebius and other early writers who we know that they did go to the temple. We know, even know from the Bible, I believe. What does Saint... So now I've talked about like a periodical literature and scholars so far, and some of my own ideas in here, some early writers as well. What does the church father Saint Jerome have to say about it? I think we should go there, because not only do we need to look at the scholars of today, but we also need to look at the scholars of the past, and see what insights they have on it. At least that's what I believe. So Saint Jerome in his homily 83, parentheses 9, speaks about the Gospel of John and the cleansing. He shows that the cleansing of the temple in John gives an accurate description of when the event occurred. Jerome presents evidence supporting the idea that room in the temple was needed, he affirms, during the days of Passover. It was prescribed by law for everyone to go to the temple, and if anyone did not go, he would be cut off from his people. So Christ was clearing room so that the house of worship could be purified and be a house of prayer for all people. Furthermore, Jerome asserts the spiritual aspect that God's grace cannot be bought or sold, rather it is free. Jesus overturned the table so the corrupt cannot sell because of their greed. Lastly, Jesus overturned the seats of the scribes and Pharisees, which shows that Christ has overthrown their authority. So in that whole section, I was just talking about St. Jerome. Some of it, I apologize, had a quote in there. Some of it had references, but all of that was my writing. So St. Jerome really did believe that Christ was clearing room for the people for Passover. He also asserted that Jesus was overturning the tables, but he overturned the seats of those who sold doves, and not to show that he was more powerful or anything like that. He was showing that he has overthrown their authority. So that is possibly why they asked him, on whose authority have you done this? All right, so the Gospel of Mark mentions that in the seats of those who were selling doves, which I just talked about with St. Jerome. So the significance of the doves was that they were significant because people who could not afford the expensive livestock such as cattle would use these as their sacrifices, and they were the least expensive. So, but even the poorest of poor could not afford birds, rather they would settle for grain. We know that through the Anchor Bible Dictionary, that doves began to be raised frequently during the Hellenistic period, and that is how doves became about during sacrifices. So the doves that were supplied to the temple were supplied from outside the city. We know that as well. And further, according to the dictionary, it says that we know I already mentioned this, but the doves were really cheap. So was there really much money to be made off of doves? I mean, was Jesus really casting them out because of how much money they made off of doves? I don't think so. I think, I really think St. Jerome was right here in the concept of clearing room, and not only clearing room, but there's an underlying of changing of authority in the temple. And I say this because the Roman government had control over the high priest's vestments, and they had control of the money as well. I think they skimmed a little bit off the top, just as the leaders of the temple, they took from these sellers as well. So it was a whole business and a whole part of corruption going on here. So I with the relatively cheapness of the doves, I don't think they're maybe making a whole lot of money. But if everybody has to come back for Passover and buy from them, or come down for Passover and buy from them, yeah, sure, there's going to be a lot of money made. But I don't really think so. All right, so I just talked about how there can't be a whole lot of money made from this, but I think we also need to take in recognition of the court of the Gentiles and the significance of the building of the temple and corruption there, because of the corruption of the Roman government. I mean, we know King Herod definitely had a role in help building the temple. Yes, he was supposed to be the king of Israel and the king, right, of the Jews, in a sense. But it's the temple is too corrupt, and we know that the temple is a complex building. It was the biggest building of the ancient world. It was massive, most complex, massive site. I mean, the temple was 172,000 square yards. I mean, or about 35 acres. I mean, that's huge. It's a huge complex. So we know that this was probably Herod's most impressive building project, and that one of the reasons for this is that he followed the original temple plans, and then he made it bigger, but he also built a royal basilica, which was above the Temple Mount on the south. So King Herod was showing that the government has authority over the temple, and they're looking down on it. So that's just crazy to think about. So the royal basilica no doubt was built to compensate for Herod's inability, since he was not a priest, to enter the temple itself. So, and that's what the Thinker Bible Dictionary speaks about. And well, that's quote, the royal basilica no doubt was built to compensate for Herod's inability, since he was not a priest, to enter the temple itself, quote, end quote. So this shows that Herod was not only great at building, but wanted to have an impression upon the temple itself. Additionally, it alludes to the fact that he controlled parts of the temple and collected money from the temple. Or for our direct answer, scholars do know that the high priest vestments were kept under lock and key by the government to get permission from the government in order to use them. So that just going back to what I said previously, earlier on. Okay, so we know that the temple itself is a massive building. So remember that the court of Gentiles is the outermost part. Well, it's also the biggest part of the temple, and there were porticos that were in it, and these are coverings. We believe that the cleansing of the temple happened on, I forget which side of it. I'll maybe find that later, but it happened in one of the porticos. It was either on the south or on the north side. I'm thinking it was the north side, and that's why not many people saw it, or the guards saw it. All right, so here's a description from the court of the Gentiles in the Holy of Holies according to Stein. I'm forgetting Stein's name here. Let me go find it. Robert Stein. All right, quote, "Within this court and separated by a fence, The series of steps leading up to it lay the court of women, the court of Israel, which only Jewish men could enter, and the temple itself, which is holy place and holy of holies. No Gentile could enter through the fence into these courts upon pain of death. So no Gentile can go farther into the inner courts upon pain of death. Okay, so if somehow the temple became overcrowded, they couldn't go farther in. They had to stay in their area or be outside the temple itself. So we know that it would die. And we know that Christ, if he was referring to the actual destruction of the temple, he would die. So Stein, in his commentary on cleansing, he kind of makes an interesting argument. He thinks that Jesus has not been targeting the corruption of the buyers and sellers. Rather, he's targeting the corruption because it is taking place within the temple itself in the court of the Gentiles. Stein, on his page 518, alludes to the fact that the temple leadership profited greatly off of the business, which I already mentioned earlier when I was speaking. So Stein, on the same page, continues to scaffold his argument by asserting, quote, "He would not allow anyone to carry a vessel through the temple. The temple was a sacred place and not to be used as a shortcut for carrying things from one place to another," end quote. So, was there not enough room for those to pray? Well, Stein insists that the cleansing takes place in the southern porticos. All right, there we have it. I was wrong. It's the southern porticos, not the northern porticos. And thus it is not visible to the guard, and it happens in a small area. Thus this is why no witness comes forth in the trial of Jesus. So he thinks that Jesus was not trying to stop the activity completely, but rather a symbolic act taking place. The symbolic action of Christ brings forth a pure place and a sacred space for prayer and worship for both Jews and Gentiles. So Stein refutes the other scholars in the sense that he was not making room. Rather, like them, he was making a house of prayer for all nations, and he's making a pure place and a sacred space, a holy place. Just like we've seen that if you're unclean, you cannot even enter the temple itself, nor the court of Gentiles. So he's making a clean place, a holy, sacred place, a place set apart that people can worship the Father. They can worship God. So let's look at for the Gospel of Matthew, what does the Jerome Biblical Commentary have to say about this? The author is a Jesuit named John L. Mackenzie. And John L. Mackenzie asserts that the priests of the temple would have had a role in selling and money changing. Otherwise, how could the businesses be there otherwise? Thus, he argues for the cases that Jesus was attacking the hierarchy of the temple directly. Mackenzie refers to Isaiah 56:7, which I said in the beginning when I was talking about periodical literature. I forget what scholar. And he also refers to Jeremiah 7:11 as a defense of Jesus for doing so. So, like St. Jerome, Mackenzie points that the messianic action of Jesus is overthrow the authority of the temple leaders. So Mackenzie believes that Matthew left out for all nations. Left out for all nations. So, quote unquote, referring to Mark 11:17. Because the worship of God is to take place through Jesus and not the temple. That's an interesting comment there that Mackenzie is making. Now Jesus is overthrowing their authority, the temple leaders, because of their corruption, but also because now worship is going to take place through Jesus to God rather than the temple to God. That's interesting that he brings that up, because Jesus' body is the temple. So is Jesus the new temple? So by Jesus overthrowing the authorities and inserting his own, he's not recognizing their authority. Thus, Jesus must have greater authority upon doing so. Okay, so another section of the Drum Biblical Commentary, written by Carol Stillmuller, CP. I forget what order CP is. Put it down in the comments down below. He writes that the chronology of the events is not the intention or the doctrinal purpose of the evangelists, so them taking place in separate times, such as on a Sunday or a Monday, or at the very beginning of the gospel after the wedding Cana, like in John. That's not the intention. Rather, Matthew and Luke occur on Sunday, but Mark occurs on a Monday. But for Luke, his purpose is to show the importance of prayer and making space for the teaching of Christ. Luke does not assert any acts of violence, such as turning of tables or a whip of cords. Luke is surely omitting these to stress that the temple is a place of teaching, prayer, and worship. So that was Stillmuller on the cleansing the temple in Luke. Which makes sense. Yeah, the evangelists definitely were not focusing on the aspect of the timeline. Otherwise, if they were trying to make a significant point of it, they would have mentioned it, or specifically said, hey, this is why I'm writing about this. So let's go to the Interpreter's Bible. The Interpreter's Bible is kind of, it's based off the King James. So I thought it was very important to explore this as well, to see what Protestant scholars have to say. So the Interpreter's Bible shows another aspect to the cleansing, or who is in charge of the revenues of the temple. In reference to the Gospel of John, the Sadducees are in charge of the temple revenue. They are the ones who are questioning Jesus for his actions, according to the scholars here. I forget which author of it says, but it's the Gospel according to St. Luke, the Gospel according to St. John. New York Abington Press is the one who made this book. So John 2:18 through 19, quote, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Quote. That's John 2:18 through 19. So Christ was not referring to the physical destruction of the temple. John recognizes that he was not referring to the destruction of the temple, but that of his body. We know that because of John 2:21, when he says that he was not referring to the destruction of the temple, but rather he was referring to his body. Okay. All right. So Father John shows that he was referring to his own death and resurrection. However, we know that the authorities took him literally, that he was going to destroy the physical temple, and that the temple had been under construction for 46 years. So the temple was still under construction. Why would he destroy something that wasn't complete? It also shows that God possibly wasn't done building its temple, and that Jesus is the finished product of the temple, that he is the new temple. So while Christ could have also predicted the destruction of the temple because of the religious and political state at the time, he was showing that a new kind of sacrifice and worship would take place. So Jesus, in a way, was telling the Jews that he is replacing the temple and he is the new sacrifice. Well, there we have it. The Gospel of John tells us a whole lot more about what's going on besides cleansing and getting rid of the corruption. He's showing that he is the new sacrifice. His body is the new temple. We're just getting a whole lot more like deep personal sense with the Gospel of John. So overall, we know that Jesus is the Messiah who came to redeem all of mankind and be the new sacrifice. We know that the Synoptic Gospels show how Jesus redeemed the Jews from corruption in the South Portico. Jesus is not making a place for him to teach, is not only making a place for him to teach, but is showing the corruptness of the temple and the hierarchy. Christ is making the temple pure for prayer and worship, that so when all gather to pray, they have a place in his Father's house. Nevertheless, the Gospel of John gives the Christian an insight into who Christ is and his mission. Jesus in John gives the Christian a preview of what he is willing to do already but also gives the future insight into how he's going to fully redeem his nations or people. So overall, there is your analysis of the cleansing of the temple, of what periodical literature says, of what church fathers say about the temple. We have Eusebius, St. Jerome, what modern day commentaries and Bible dictionaries say. I mean, there's so much in it, but it's just crazy. He definitely was not referring to the physical destruction of the temple. I think that's a hard line to defend there. I think that's a really hard line for E.P. Saunders to defend. I also think that if we have the burden of proof to prove that that's not what he's referring to, it's pretty easy because the Gospel of John states that is not the case. Unless E.P. Saunders is just, well, we have to only stay on the Synoptic Gospel side. All right, well, I digress now. So, thank you for listening. I know this is a longer episode than usual, but I wanted to do something special and actually go deep into an exegetical analysis for you guys. This was based off of my exegetical paper that I had to write for my Intro to Gospels class this past semester. Then the school year did go very well, and I wanted to present it to you guys. So thank you for listening. If you somehow stuck around to the end, hopefully I can make more videos like this, so please like and subscribe or leave a comment. I would really appreciate it. I know Luke would appreciate it as well.